In 1241, the Mongol army marched through the heart of Europe. The Knights of Poland had been destroyed at Legnica. The Hungarians were massacred at Mohi. The road to Vienna lay open. There was nothing left between Batu Khan and the Atlantic. Nothing, except the news that came from the eastern steppes. The great Khan had died. The greatest conquering army in human history had swept through Russia like a storm. It toppled the principalities of Kiev, Vladimir, and Ryazan. It crossed Poland, Hungary, reached the shores of the Adriatic. In 13 years of campaigning, it subjugated peoples of completely different cultures, languages, and geographies. Well-armed knights, fortified cities, professional armies, all fell. And yet, when the Mongols withdrew from Europe and turned their horses eastward, there was a question that almost no one asks even today. Why was there still a people in the Urals who had never submitted to them, who never fell, who never accepted Mongol rule? For 14 years. On the banks of the Yaik River, at the foot of the southern Urals, there was a tribe of semi-nomads whom the Mongols simply could not eliminate. 14 years of attempts, 14 years of raids, forced retreats, new attempts with greater force. And in the end, when the Western campaign concluded, they were still there, never subjugated, never under Mongol control. Documented by a Franciscan monk who personally entered the Mongol court and wrote what he saw, a contemporary account made by someone who was physically there. They were called the Bashkirs. You've probably never heard of them. The history of the Bashkirs was swallowed by silence, not because it was unimportant, but because it didn't fit the molds of the stories we usually tell. What did this tribe have that all the others didn't? What did the Mongols find in that valley that forced them to calculate, recalculate, and in the end, go around rather than destroy? What makes a 14-year resistance possible against the most sophisticated and disciplined military force of the 13th century? By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what it was. I can guarantee you one thing. It's not the story you think it is. To understand why Bashkir resistance is extraordinary, you first need to understand what they were facing. Not just the Mongols were powerful. That doesn't capture the reality. You need to understand the specific mechanics of why people didn't survive encounters with this army. The Mongol army wasn't just a cavalry force. It was an integrated system of warfare unlike anything that existed in the 13th century. It starts with mobility. A Mongol soldier on campaign traveled with multiple horses. Estimates vary from 3 to 5 per warrior. This meant the army never slowed down because the horses tired. While opponents were still gathering their forces, the Mongols had already crossed hundreds of kilometers. They arrived before you knew they were coming. But mobility was only the beginning. What made the Mongols truly formidable was intelligence. Before any major campaign, networks of spies and scouts mapped routes, resources, political tensions, divisions among enemies. When the Mongol army appeared, it rarely appeared unprepared. It was you who was caught off guard. And the war machine arrived with a tactical repertoire that most opponents simply couldn't counter simultaneously. Mounted archers who fired with precision at full gallop, heavy infantry for sieges, engineers captured from conquered populations, and the famous feigned retreat, strategically withdrawing to lure enemy forces into open terrain, then surrounding them from all sides. There was also the psychological element. The Mongols deliberately cultivated a reputation of total destruction for those who resisted, and mercy for those who surrendered. It was a cold and efficient calculation. Cities that capitulated survived. Cities that resisted became examples. This mechanism reduced the cost of each subsequent conquest because populations already knew what happened to the stubborn. Now, add a variable that most people don't consider: the Western campaign had a deadline, and that deadline was imposed not by the enemy, but by the Mongol state itself. Ogedei Khan, son of Genghis Khan and Great Khan of the Mongol Empire, was the man whose authority held the entire structure of the empire together. Without him, the system of loyalties and power that kept the different Mongol factions aligned would become fragile. And Ogedei, in 1235, when the Kurultai, the Great Mongol Assembly, formally authorized the Western campaign, was no longer a robust man. He drank excessively. His health was an open secret on the steppes. This matters directly for the Bashkirs, and I'll explain exactly how further on. For now, what you need to keep in mind is this. Each month, the Western campaign took longer than planned, was another month during which a weakened Great Khan could die, and the entire empire could implode into succession disputes. Batu Khan, the commander of the campaign, was the grandson of Genghis Khan. Subutai, his senior general, was probably the most sophisticated military strategist of the century. Together, they conducted the campaign with precision. Rus fell in 1237-1238. The southwest was swept clean. By 1241, they were in Poland and Hungary simultaneously. Every resistance had a cost, and the Bashkirs had resisted since 1229, 6 years before the campaign was even formally authorized. While the main armies of Rus fell in weeks, this obscure tribe in the Urals had still not been subdued. Why? What did they have? The secret was not in their strength. It was in where they lived. But before we get to the terrain, before explaining the mechanism that destroyed the Mongol cavalry's advantage, you need to know who the Bashkirs were, because understanding the people is inseparable from understanding the place. And there's a detail about the Bashkirs that almost no one mentions. The man who immortalized them in history was not a warrior. He was a Franciscan friar on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court. And what he wrote would change what we know about this forgotten chapter of medieval warfare. Before Islam reached the southern Urals, before any imperial power crossed those steppes, the Bashkirs were already there. They were a Turkic, semi-nomadic people, and this distinction matters. Semi-nomadic doesn't mean disorganized. It means their organization was different from the sedentary fixedness that Mongol armies dominated best. The Bashkirs migrated seasonally, following the pastures and the rhythms of the Yaik River, what the Russians would later call the Ural River. Their settlements were not cities. They were temporary camps, dismountable structures, encampments that could vanish and reappear dozens of kilometers away. More than a material limitation, this mobility was a strategy embedded in their culture, even if they didn't see it that way. It was simply how one lived in that place, with that land, with that river. And inadvertently, it created a population that had nothing permanent to be besieged. Their military tradition was mounted archers and cavalry warriors, similar on the surface to the Mongol tradition itself. The Bashkirs knew how to ride, knew how to shoot, understood mobile warfare. But there was one crucial difference. They knew their terrain in a way no outside invader could replicate. Each bend of the Yaik, each birch grove, each seasonal marsh, each crossing route. This knowledge was passed down generation to generation, inscribed in the everyday act of hunting, fishing, and moving camps. Socially, the Bashkirs were organized into tribes and clans, not a centralized state with a capital to capture, a king to depose, an administrative structure to replace. And that was the nightmare for any general trying to subjugate them. There was no throne to take, no capital to besiege, no king whose neck would determine the surrender of an entire people. It was like trying to capture smoke. For the Mongols, who had a proven formula for subduing kingdoms and empires, this created an immediate problem. There was no head to cut off. There was no political center of gravity that, if destroyed, would solve the problem. They inhabited what we now call the Southern Urals, a region of rivers, forests, transitional steppe plains, and low mountain terrain. The amphibious nature of that landscape, neither open steppe nor closed forest, but the two intertwined with rivers and marshes, was the most important ingredient in this entire story. But we haven't gotten to that yet. What you need to hold on to for now is the image. A people who moved with the terrain instead of against it, who built no walls because they needed no walls, who were scattered across space rather than concentrated in one place, who lived within a landscape that was about to prove itself the most formidable adversary Mongol cavalry had ever encountered. And then there is Giovanni da Pian del Carpine. Carpine was an Italian Franciscan friar, sent by Pope Innocent IV in 1245 on an extraordinary mission to travel to the court of the great Mongol Khan and assess the threat to European Christendom. It was an almost suicidal task for a middle-aged man, crossing territories the Mongols had just devastated. But Carpine arrived. He entered the court, he observed, he spoke with Mongol officials, and in 1247, back in Europe, he wrote his account. In that document, Carpine mentions the Bashkirs, not as a casual footnote, but as a people the Mongols, at the time of his visit, had still not completely subdued. Why does this matter? Because Carpine was not a historian writing centuries later. He was a contemporary, a direct observer, someone who was physically in the Mongol court 5 years after the end of the Western campaign, and recorded that these Yike semi-nomads had still not been pacified. That document exists, and it's part of what makes this story verifiable. Not folklore, not myth, but history documented by an eyewitness in 1247. But before we get to the friar and what he wrote, we need to go back to 1229, to the first encounter, to that moment when the Mongols arrived at the Yike River for the first time and found something their maps had not predicted. 1229. The formal Western campaign had not yet been authorized. The Kurultai that would give the official signal for the great invasion of the West would not happen until 1235. But the Mongol army never waited for formal authorizations to explore. Reconnaissance forces and preliminary incursions were already testing the margins of the known world. And one of those forces turned toward the Southern Urals. What did the Mongols expect to find? Probably what they had found in dozens of other places. A population that could be intimidated, subdued, or destroyed in direct confrontation. Perhaps a lesser people who would yield before the approach of an organized force, or who would attempt to resist in an open field and be swept away by Mongol tactical supremacy. What they found was different. The Bashkirs avoided direct confrontation in the field. Instead of organizing a line of battle or defending a fortress, they did something that, by Mongol doctrine, had no efficient response. They evaporated into the terrain. Far from being a desperate flight, it was an entirely different form of warfare. The encampments vanished before the Mongol forces arrived. The herds were moved to inaccessible terrain. Families dispersed into forested valleys and riverside marshes that Mongol horses simply could not cross efficiently. And when the invading force advanced through that landscape searching for something to destroy, they found only silence, and then attacks coming from directions that made no tactical sense. The Bashkirs knew every crossing of the Yike. They knew which areas appeared solid, but would sink under the weight of an armored horse. They knew where the river widened and became shallow enough for quick foot crossings, but too deep for cavalry in formation. They knew how to move through the birch and spruce forests of the valley without leaving visible traces, because they had done it their entire lives. The Mongols, on the other hand, entered an environment that negated their primary operational advantage: speed across open terrain. A cavalry column that could cross a steppe at 50 kilometers a day became, in those rivers and forests, something slow, predictable, and vulnerable. The communication lines between units, so vital to Mongol tactical coordination, fragmented when scouts could not move freely. And the Bashkirs knew how to exploit this fact. Instead of seeking victories in pitched battles, the goal was to make each Mongol advance too costly to continue. An attack on an isolated column here, an ambush at a river ford there. Disappearance before retaliation. Reappearance when the invading force withdrew. It was a form of resistance that did not accumulate victories in the conventional sense. There was no moment when a Mongol general could point to a map and say, "They were defeated here." But the cost in time, in men, in horses, in morale, kept accumulating. The Mongol force withdrew, not defeated in battle, simply unable to achieve a resolution. With no fixed populations to pacify, no infrastructure to capture, no centralized leadership to decapitate. And they came back. Not once over more than a decade, repeatedly, each time encountering variations of the same problem. The Mongols were patient. They had besieged cities for months. They had crossed deserts and frozen steppes to reach their objectives. They did not give up easily, but there were concrete reasons to keep trying. Controlling that flank of the Urals was strategically valuable for any lasting presence in Eastern Europe. It was the difference between a protected supply route and a permanently vulnerable flank. They could not simply ignore the Bashkirs while marching west. With each attempt, the same result. And the explanation for this begins with the river. The Bashkirs' secret was not in their spears. It was beneath the hooves of the Mongol horses. The Yaik River today, known as the Ural River, rises in the eastern slopes of the southern Urals and flows south to the Caspian Sea. In the 13th century, it was a living, seasonal river system that created along its valley a landscape alternating between dense forests, riverside marshes, seasonal floodplains, and low, mountainous terrain. It was not the dramatic horror of an impenetrable jungle. It was something more insidious. Terrain that appeared crossable, but consistently revealed itself as a logistical nightmare for large-scale cavalry forces. Think about what Mongol cavalry needed to function. It needed lateral space to deploy in flanking formations, to envelop the enemy, to use its numerical superiority in motion. An open steppe provided that. A forested valley did not. The corridors between the trees' narrow passages that seemed like natural routes of advance in practice channeled Mongol columns into zones where flanking was impossible and ambush was inevitable. A force of 10,000 riders that entered one of these corridors became a single file-long, narrow, without maneuvering power. And the Bashkirs knew exactly where those corridors ended. It needed speed for communication lines, the system of messenger riders that made the Mongol army coherent, capable of coordinating simultaneous attacks across fronts separated by kilometers, depended on scouts who could move freely. In open terrain, a rider could cover enormous distances. In dense forests with marshes between the trees, he advanced at a quarter of the speed, or simply did not advance. It needed pasture. Each Mongol warrior traveled with multiple horses. An army of reasonable size, therefore, had an enormous forage requirement. The open steppe provided that pasture. The Yaik's riparian forest did not. Each week of campaigning in that terrain consumed reserves that could not be replenished locally. And the valley plains, which in summer seemed to offer sufficient pasture, became mudflats or flood zones in other seasons, transforming terrain that scouts had described as passable into an obstacle that cost lives and horses. And then there were the river crossings. Rivers are not merely geographical obstacles for armies. They are critical points of vulnerability. A cavalry force crossing a river in formation is slow, disorganized, and incapable of defending itself effectively. Cavalry must get out of the water before they can fight back. And here the Bashkirs had an advantage no invading army could buy. Every ford of the Yaik was known to them since childhood. They knew where the water was deep enough to drown a horse, where the bank was solid, and where it sank, and in what time of year each crossing changed character. The first Mongol cavalry to emerge from the water often found an arrow, because the Bashkirs were already positioned where any rational scout would choose to cross. The Bashkirs did not build fortresses. They didn't need to. The entire landscape was their fortress. A fortress without walls, without gates, without fixed points to attack. The Mongols had mastered city sieges precisely because there was a discrete object to destroy, a concentrated population to pressure, a moment when defenses collapsed. Against a population dispersed across a valley of rivers and forests, siege was impossible. There was no center to encircle. This concept, defensive depth without walls, is what the Bashkirs instinctively employed, and it was what frustrated the Mongol formula. The most effective army of its era was fundamentally an instrument of concentrated offense. It worked best when there was something to destroy in a specific place. Against targets that dissolved into the terrain, the machine lost efficiency dramatically. And the Bashkirs were not alone. West of the Urals, in the valleys of the Oka and Volga, the Mordvins, a Finno-Ugric people of forest and swamp, produced the same result against the same forces during the 1237 to 1242 campaign. Different languages, different culture, different history, but the same essential pattern: river and forest terrain, dispersed organization, no fixed infrastructure to besiege. A coincidence like this is not a coincidence. It's a pattern. And a pattern reveals a structural flaw. But here is the question that terrain alone cannot answer. The Mongols were patient. They had broken walled cities. Terrain explains the difficulty, but it does not explain 14 years. Why not isolate the Bashkirs, pressure them systematically, and wait? The answer is not in geography. It is in the calendar, and in a man who drank too much. 14 years. You need to stop for a moment and really feel the weight of that number. In 1229, when the Mongols made first contact with the Bashkirs, the Western campaign had not even been formally authorized. The Rus still had their cities. Polish knights were still alive. Vienna was still a distant dream of conquest. As the machinery of history's greatest conquering empire began to move toward the west, in the southern Urals, a tribe of semi-nomads was already resisting. And it resisted while everything around it fell. In 1237, the Mongols entered the Rus. Ryazan fell in December. Vladimir fell in February. The system of principalities that had defined the Rus for centuries began to crumble like dominoes. Populations that survived did so as subjects, paying tribute, accepting Mongol administration. Meanwhile, in the Urals, the Bashkirs continued. In 1238, when the Mongols withdrew to the steppe to reorganize before the next push, there were still incursions in the Yaik valleys. There were still attempts to establish control, to extract obedience, to resolve that unfinished problem. There was still failure. What does it mean to be never completely subjugated in practice? This hardly means that the Bashkirs emerged victorious from each encounter. They paid an immense price. Village after village burned when the Mongols managed to locate encampments. Herds captured. People killed or taken. The human cost of 14 years of resistance against the most powerful army of the century was not small. It was catastrophic in absolute terms. Consider this. While Kiev burned and Poland buried its knights, There were children in the Yike valleys who had never slept 2 months in the same place, not because they were nomadic by nature alone, but because the enemy had arrived and never completely left. An entire generation that grew up between 1229 and 1242 grew up in perpetual movement, with the awareness that stopping could mean death. But subjugated in Mongol vocabulary meant something specific. An administration installed, a tribute system functioning, a population that responded to the Khan's authority. And this never happened with the Bashkirs. There was no Mongol governor in the Yike valleys. There was no regular tribute collection. There was no pacification of the population. The social cohesion that kept the Bashkir clans functioning under this pressure was in itself an extraordinary feat. Smaller communities, without the support of a centralized state, tended to fragment under sustained military pressure, some groups capitulating, others fleeing to territories beyond reach, collective resistance dissolving into individual survival. The fact that the Bashkirs maintained a resistance sufficiently coherent to make each Mongol incursion a recurring problem, and not a definitive solution, is remarkable for reasons that go beyond tactics. And the Mongols kept returning because they had to. The northeastern flank was strategically vital for any lasting presence in Eastern Europe. An insubmissive population in the Urals represented a constant threat to the communication lines between the emerging Mongol factions and the routes that would sustain what would become the Golden Horde. There was no option to simply ignore the Bashkirs while the empire advanced westward. It was an open account that needed to be closed. But the account wouldn't close. By 1241, Poland had lost armies. Hungary was in collapse. The Holy Roman Empire was debating where to make its final stand. And within Batu Khan, a decision was taking shape. The further the campaign advanced westward, the more the northeastern flank, that unsolvable problem in the Urals, became a strategic vulnerability, not merely an inconvenience. Because if the Bashkirs had never been subjugated, then what Batu was building in the east, what would become the Golden Horde, had an exposed flank. A population that had never accepted Mongol authority, that had demonstrated for a decade it was capable of active resistance, was in the Urals. The Great Khan was sick in Karakorum. The campaign had a window that was closing. A decision was coming that would shape the fate of the entire Western campaign. And the Bashkirs were the reason that decision was made the way it was. Ogadei Khan died in December 1241. The news reached the Western Front, while Batu Khan was still in Hungary. And what had been a latent pressure for years, the Great Khan's deteriorating health, uncertainty about succession, the Mongol factions already circling around power in Karakorum, became an immediate crisis. Batu had to return. All the Genghisid princes had to return for the Kurultai that would choose the next Great Khan. It was the law of the steppe. The campaign stopped. The reason was not a military defeat or insurmountable European resistance, but rather the succession mechanics of the empire, which made the return mandatory, and any general who remained in the West during a Kurultai would lose political standing irreversibly. But here's what Ogadei's death explains, and what it doesn't. It explains why the campaign ended in 1241, 1242 instead of continuing. It doesn't explain why the Bashkirs, at that moment, still hadn't been resolved. It doesn't explain why, when the Mongol army reorganized on its return to the steppe, the Golden Horde, the Khanate Batu established on the Pontic and Caspian steppes, was configured geographically and administratively around the Bashkir problem, not through it. The Golden Horde settled to the south and east of Bashkir territory, not within it. The effective limits of the Golden Horde's control stopped at the margins of that unsolvable terrain. And this wasn't for lack of trying, it was the result of a strategic calculation Batu Khan eventually made. The cost of completely subduing the Bashkirs was greater than the benefit the conquest would produce. Let's be specific about that cost. To force pacification of a population dispersed across river and forest terrain, you would need a sustained campaign in conditions that destroyed the cavalry's advantage. You would need to maintain forces in the field in an environment that increased casualties and reduced efficiency. You would need to build administrative presence in a space that resisted administration by its very nature. And all this while the main campaign had far greater Western objectives and the Empire's own power structure was in flux. Compare that with what conquest typically produced. A subjugated people that paid tribute, provided recruits, added wealth to the Mongol system. The Bashkirs, even subjugated, would be a marginal addition to an empire that already stretched from Korea to the Danube. The return didn't justify the investment. The decision was based purely on a rational equation, and the Bashkirs had made the cost column large enough to change the outcome. There was only one person who took the time to write about what had happened in the Urals. Far from being a general or a court chronicler, it was an Italian Franciscan monk in his 60s, crossing devastated territories on a mission few expected him to survive. Giovanni da Pian del Carpin left Leon in April 1245. Pope Innocent IV had charged him with a mission that bordered on diplomatic suicide. Travel to the center of Mongol power, deliver a papal letter to the Great Khan, and return with any useful intelligence about those forces that had devastated Eastern Europe. Karpin crossed Poland in ruins, traversed the steppes where the Rus had been massacred, entered the territories of the emerging Golden Horde, and eventually reached the Mongol court in Mongolia in July 1246, coinciding with the enthronement of the new Great Khan, Guyuk. He survived. He returned. And in 1247, he wrote the Historia Mongolorum, the history of the Mongols. Far from being the work of a court chronicler seeking to please a patron, this document was an intelligence report, produced for the highest religious authority in the West by a man with pragmatic reasons to observe with precision and record without romanticism. Karpin described Mongol military organization, their tactics, their customs, their power structure, with the eyes of someone who had personally crossed the territories the Mongol army had devastated and who had spoken directly with Mongol officials about the state of their borders. And in this document, Karpin records the Bashkirs. They are described as a verified reality by crossing the territories of the Golden Horde, confirmed by asking the Mongol officials themselves what had still not been resolved, discarding any rumor or third-party account. 5 years after the campaign's end, the greatest army of the century had still not pacified that people in the Urals. And Karpin noted this with the precision of someone who had a mission: to inform the Pope about what the Mongol Empire had conquered and what it had not. Why does this matter so much? Because it dispels the idea of folklore or a late chronicle trying to reconstruct events from collective memory. This is a primary document, written in 1247 by an observer who was physically there, a man who had crossed through ruined Poland and devastated Rus and entered the court of the enemy itself. When Karpin writes that the Bashkirs were not subjugated, this is verifiable history, not the legend of a people without writing transformed into myth, but the direct notation of an eyewitness. The Bashkirs appear in a primary document of the 13th century precisely because they had no scribes of their own, did not build palaces to photograph, did not leave monuments that tourists visit today. They appear because an Italian Franciscan made an extraordinary journey and had the discipline to write what he saw. What he saw confirms what the patterns suggested, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The Mordvins lived in the valleys of the Oka and Volga, west of the Urals, a Finno-Ugric people of forest and swamp, with no linguistic or cultural relation to the Turkish Bashkirs. Different gods, different language, different history. But when the Mongols arrived in their region during the campaign of 1237 to 1242, the result was strangely familiar. The Mongols never completed the pacification. The forest and river terrain prevented effective control by cavalry. The dispersed organization of the Mordvins provided no fixed targets to destroy, and the return on investment of a total subjugation campaign simply did not justify the cost. Two peoples, different in everything except the essential. They lived in river and forest terrain, they were organized in a dispersed manner, and they had no fixed infrastructure to besiege. And both produced the same result against the most effective army of their era. This is not coincidence, it is a pattern. And the pattern reveals a structural vulnerability in Mongol military design that popular history almost never discusses. The system was optimized for the steppe. It was devastatingly effective in open space. And it had a specific blind spot: river and forest terrain with distributed populations and no centers of gravity to destroy. The blind spot was not unknown to Mongol generals. Subutai was too intelligent not to perceive the pattern. But perceiving a vulnerability does not mean having a solution. The Mongol army was what it was because it had been forged on the steppe. Reconfiguring it for river-forest warfare would have required fundamental changes in logistics, training, force composition, and with a Western campaign to conduct, with a great Khan in ill health, with the greatest geopolitical prize of the era within reach, there was neither time nor motivation to solve that peripheral problem in a fundamental way. The system had a flaw, and the Bashkirs lived within it. What did the resistance of the Bashkirs mean for the rest of history? Consider, the Western campaign was designed to expand Mongol control over what Mongol generals saw as the inhabited world: Rus, Central Europe, eventually beyond. If the campaign were to reconstitute itself after Ogedei's death and attempt to continue westward, it would encounter a vulnerable northeastern flank, a people in the Urals who had never accepted Mongol authority and who could, with the army dispersed across western fronts, become a real logistical threat to the supply lines that would sustain any advance. The Bashkirs did not save Europe alone. That would be an exaggeration this channel does not make. The death of Ogedei was the immediate cause of the campaign's end. But in Batu's calculation of whether and how to reconstitute the Western campaign after the Kurultai, a calculation that never resulted in a new large-scale invasion, the existence of an insoluble flank in the Urals was a factor that any rational general included in the equation. And so, what does this story teach? And what did the Bashkirs have that all the others did not have, besides the river? They had the ability to convert their own environment into a precision weapon. Rather than a larger army or a taller fortress, they possessed such deep local knowledge that the terrain became an extension of their own tactics, and they had a social structure that could not be decapitated, not because they were invulnerable, but because they distributed their vulnerability so widely that there was no single point of rupture. Resistance does not require equality of force. It requires intelligent asymmetry, using what you have where you have it, in a way that the attacker cannot use what he has. The Bashkirs never tried to win on the Mongols' field. They made their own field unusable for the enemy. That terrain is not merely a logistical variable. It is a weapon. In the hands of those who know it deeply, against an enemy who does not, it levels fields that would otherwise be impossible to level. And that the most important history is not always the one that wins a name. It is the one that changes the calculation of whoever could have destroyed everything, without anyone around knowing that this was happening. The Bashkirs left no written records of their own resistance. There is no Bashkir epic, no chronicle of battles, no genealogy of heroes documented in their own words. What remains is what Carpine recorded, the direct account of an eyewitness who was there. But they existed. They resisted. For 14 years, against the mightiest army of their era, they lived within an empire's blind spot and refused to yield. And an Italian Franciscan monk, crossing devastated territories on an almost suicidal mission for the Pope, stopped to record what he saw. If you've made it this far, you're part of a small group of people who know this story. A like helps this channel keep digging up what was buried. Share this with someone who deserves to know. And subscribe for the next story no one is telling. Until next time.